Great, so good evening everyone. We're here at Webb's Gallery in Mount Eden, and it's my pleasure to have Andrew McLeod here with me. We're going to be having a bit of a conversation about three of Andrew's works, which are in our sensational upcoming auction, Melting Moments, a collection of contemporary art. So first up, Andrew, thanks very much for joining us this evening.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's lovely to see these works of yours here, and it's quite interesting that there's a sort of a linearity to them. So we've got a work from 1999, this one behind us, which is from 2009, and then another one from 2003.
Yeah, it's still quite a while. Still a long time ago for me in a way.
Sure.
I've made a lot of paintings since then.
Yes.
But yeah, it's incredibly valuable to see them. Okay?
Yeah.
In real life.
So thinking about this work over here, so this is one that you painted in 1999.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a little bit of context for that sort of time? What's it that you did?
I was still at art school, Elam, in Te Toiho department, which was run by Selwyn Muru and Brent Graham. I was consider myself very lucky to be in that department. So I did my undergraduate, and then I did a year of a master's, and that would have been 99. And that same year, I had my first solo show at Ivan Anthony Gallery in Auckland. So the work was shown in that and sold in that show. So
and that's the first time you've seen it since then?
I think it is in real life. Yeah.
Sure. Should we just have a little wander over there and have a look at this painting? Because there's something about this painting that I find really interesting, and that really comes to the surface of the work. So looking at this work, the paint finish here is really flat, like you've sort of sought to kind of rein in the brush strokes of the paint and kind of get it a really even finish.
Yeah, I mean it's totally the language of like Gordon Walters, maybe like Sandy Edsett, stuff. I mean I was really into Pacific and Maori art history and Maori artists, contemporary Maori artists at the time, and Walters. And Scone. Selwyn Muru loved Gordon Walters.
Oh yeah.
And I followed Selwyn's, influence. He had a big influence on me.
Yeah,
and but so definitely referencing stuff like that. But within that, so it's layers of watery acrylic, thin acrylic, definitely making reference to Gordon Walters. And but still within that, there's definitely personal stuff going on like you would see in a Walters. So even with geometric abstraction and paintwork, there is always personal stuff going on in paintwork. So paintwork is also really important for Walters.
Sure.
So layering, thin acrylic. He had a lot of layers of acrylic, and me as a practitioner, I can learn the language, so you see what other painters do. Does that answer the question?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
No, it's an interesting thing when there's because I think one of the things that I find so compelling about painting is the materiality of paint.
Yeah.
And it's got so many different qualities with how it can be sort of layered and applied, and sort of something like this where there's this quite sort of even finish to the paintwork actually kind of contrasts quite significally with what you've done in this other painting.
But I can still see the same hand in this and that.
Yes.
Now, especially seeing up close, it's still definitely, it's always individual, it's a thing like you can, every artist has their own touch, their own brush stroke, their own, it's choreography and layering, choreography of movement, brush stroke, so it's interesting. It does reference that geometric abstract stuff, but still within that, it's interesting. It's all just a matter of how close up you get and engage with the materiality.
Yeah, sure.
Would you say? I think.
Definitely. I mean, and that's something that with painting, when you see it on a digital platform, whether it's on Instagram or a website or something, you just don't get that sort of materiality. It doesn't really translate. Even if you've got something that makes a sort of sumptuous image,
it's the combination. It's paintwork, composition, and content. old tech
Yes.
working together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is the art form,
Yeah, and composition is something that I really want to talk to you about with this work over here, from the MLI. This is the 2009 painting. Because with this painting, I mean, there's a few things that I'm really intrigued by about this. There is this very dramatic contrast in terms of paint application. Like it's something that's probably quite hard to see on the screen, but this is really thickly layered up. And maybe if you sort of come in and look at some of this textural detail, it's a very different kind of painting and a very different sort of method of paint application that you've used here, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things is oil paint. So the oil and acrylic is a kind of great divide in painting in a way, contemporary painting, and just different languages in a way. But yeah, the same artist, great things can be done with both. But yeah, this is really talking to the medium.
Sure.
I mean, definitely, one of the things about oil is it just has colour. A way it just delivers colour in a way that actually acrylic doesn't really. So, and that's something that doesn't really photograph or translate onto video. So, I mean, when I saw this work again a few days ago when I came to see the viewing, I was really reacquainting myself with what I'd actually done, because you really can't see in photograph the finer compositional things. And with this work, there's a lot of colour stuff relating to composition. There's a lot of sort of low contrast grey stuff, sort of what I call low chroma, and then there's highlights of really bright high chroma colour, and even things like which parts of the painting are shiny. So this part's are shiny, and that delivers the colour very differently. So this part here is grey. There's a bit of grey in the colour, and that's and it's also matte. So the same paint with a shiny layer on top, or a shiny medium, or a matte medium, the colour's completely different. So there's definitely a play of I'm very happy with the very individualistic, in terms of sensibility, sort of my own sensibility of composition and colour. I can see that in this work. It's very shows my personality in those things, in paintwork and colour, definitely. Yeah, sort of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point you made about colour there is really interesting, because sort of coming to this, and I know this is something that you are sort of seeing it from the perspective from which you made it, but coming to this, the thing that sort of strikes me is colour, and it's a sort of I guess one of those clever devices of painting that aren't necessarily apparent at first glance, that the colour is really popping like that because of the way that you've used those quite muted greys and sort of olive greens. And that really gets the sort of the more bright and potent colours to sort of really pop off the surface. Yeah,
creating the context within a composition for things to happen. I mean, it's all a play between subject matter and the way it's painted. Say the colour of what the subject matter is, or whether I want you to pay attention. It's an arrangement. A painting is an arrangement of attention, and also there's frozen movement in a way as well. Like so, as just like when painters talk about paintwork, that's it's movement that you can see. You can see the hand, and that's a very important part of the art form. So if you look at the two works either side, there's a Liz Moy and a Bill Hammond, and the paintwork is in both works is both brilliant and very individualistic to them. And the paintwork goes with the way they compose the composition and the content. So you're always striving to get everything working together with your personality, and you're sort of limited to your own sensibility with regard to those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating lineup in that regard, isn't it? Like seeing your work with Bill Hammond and Liz Moore's here, because they are all such sort of distinctive kind of aesthetics and ways of working that sort of come through in painting. You know, they're all really polished in their own ways, but they're, you know, like it's the sort of level of detail of these kind of highlights and plays of light in this work of Liz Moore's here. And then this, what's going on with Bill Hammond over here. You know, this is sort of different again. You know, there's the use of kind of washes and paint runs, and sort of a different technical approach. And coming back to your painting, this has got your own sensibility really sort of stamped on it.
Yeah, I think you kind of go down. It really should be the case that with every individual work, every individual painting, you go down you follow what happens on the canvas and what happens on the composition, with the composition. Every individual work, you do have to follow each one a little bit as well, so that's an extra level of complexity. It really, in the best painters, it really doesn't, one doesn't really replace another. Each one is in its individual thing, has its own fine balance with regard to everything, paintwork, composition, and content. And I can really see that happening in this work. It was this particular work is kind of a combination of a few paintings I'd done before. And so I was kind of combining a few of my earlier paintings I'd done in the last, say, 2 years. And so I really got used to the subject matter and what to do with it compositionally. And that's one thing I think you can see in this. But also within that, I can really see, especially with colour, I was mixing colour really differently to the other ones in that series in those years. And just developing something as I went along. It's got a really great kind of muted grey, powdery, kind of wintry garden, like, or autumn, you know, kind of like, or burning leaves, and like, which is in this part of the painting, maybe like smoke, but then green, you know, and references to being in the world, you know, the seasons and stuff, gardens. My parents were amazing gardeners, so I grew up in a garden. I've always been aware of, it's a huge influence. It still is. You'll see it in the other work too, like the use of the logic of garden, the way gardens, the way you can have a flower high up, because flowers do grow, and you can see through the stem of the flower or something, or you can see through the foliage and see what's behind it. So you get that play of transparencies that's subject matter. It's definitely a kind of pastoral garden kind of.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, because I think one of the things that really stood out to me coming to this painting and to my eye was the fact, what I was really intrigued by was that it has so many different elements. The butterflies, the birds, the trees, the fruit, the flaming leaves, but it all hangs together in a compositional sense, in a very kind of it works as a single image, even though it has these myriad components.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's really important. I mean, the other thing I guess to say is that in painting, things are composed to the scale. The composition and the scale is also really important. So everything adds up. Everything works at the size of the object. So that's a real difficult thing about looking at reproductions. Say for example, one of the Hammond, the later Hammond in this auction, I didn't really like that much in reproduction, but seeing it in real life, it's like, that's a really good painting. You know? It's like the scale of the figures really makes it work, and So, I mean, that's, yeah.
Perhaps we can pay that painting a visit in just a moment.
Yeah.
There's one other thing I wanted to discuss with you in relation to this, and this is something that we talked about a little bit earlier, was the fact that you use digital tools in developing the compositions of your works.
Yeah.
So is that sort of Photoshop or InDesign or?
Yeah, mostly Photoshop, and yeah, I always thought it was a good idea to not be afraid or lazy about all the tools that are available now that graphic designers or illustrators have, and it's definitely hard work, and it costs a lot of money keeping up with that stuff, but it's definitely interesting integrating that into a practice, and it's an ongoing thing, the integration of that as another compositional tool. I guess it's just the more things you add in your compositional, in the ways that your composing techniques, the more complex the whole thing gets, and I like that. I like the complexity. So I draw, and I do digital drawing, and I collage different things in Photoshop, and there's a great play back and forth you can do. You can draw back in digitally, you can do digital painting, and yeah, really interesting and fruitful. But yeah, you've got to make sure that you know, there's still stuff that happens on the canvas every time, and so yeah, when you're composing or drawing, you're always anticipating this exact scale and how you're going to translate the subject matter into the paintwork and everything. Yeah, that's what we're talking about, hey? That extra step, hey? How you think that you know, because you know your own work, hey?
Yes.
So when you're drawing, it's a lot of anticipation. It's not as though it's all done in the drawing. Yeah.
No, indeed, and that's one of the things about painting, I think, and that, you know, coming back to the sort of the surface and texture, is that there are things that happen in painting that no matter how planned the composition is, there are always going to be things that happen within the process of painting that take on a sort of a life and energy of their own.
Yeah. There's no other way to get colour in the way that a lot of painting does. This is a great example of that, actually. There's so many different pigments available, and they can all be used in different ways. There's opaque pigments, there's transparent pigments, and they all do different things, and it's a whole world of, especially oil painting, that is really important to the art form. And as a painter, talking to people who are interested in painting, I want to encourage people. So always go up close to the painting, wherever you are, you know, at the Tate, in the Prado, around the, you know, always go up to the painting and have a look at what the artist is telling you in that way. Because we talk to each other down the generations, you know, it's totally, I looked at McCann, Walters, Angus, you know, it's like, it goes down the generations with regard to that finer stuff of paintwork composition. Layering is a big thing, the way the two different layers interact. Yeah, it's a whole world. Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Yes, indeed, yeah. And those kinds of historic conversations are sort of a fascinating part of what happens within painting. And I think, you know, the way that painting is kind of both of a time, the time in which it's made, and also, in a sense, kind of like this timeless or very long conversation, you know, in sort of in a visual language, you know, material language.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
Great. So if we have a look at this other painting of yours that we've got over yonder, this one's titled Interior with Pink. Yeah, this is from 2011, Andrew?
Yeah. So yeah, it's not too long after the other one. Yeah.
It's quite a different sort of approach to image making that you've used with this work, though, isn't it?
Yeah. It's definitely a different period of my work. I definitely say that than the other work. So and definitely relates to the. When you're talking about generations, I mean, there's generational stuff which I see happening in this. I don't know whether this could have been made by an older painter, really. In a way, there's a sort of acknowledgement that of a wider, there's a lack of a fear of a wider visual culture, or referencing or being influenced by, say, textiles or furniture, or going further back, like there's Egyptian references, a lot of arts and crafts, design stuff happening, references. Definitely the complexity of visual culture in the 19th century is something I got more into after that work over there, including painting. 19th century painting is amazing and very complex and huge. And I think a lot of older artists were trained to define themselves against a lot of 19th century stuff, and felt that they were modernists, and that's cool and fine. I mean, we're always trying to it's natural to look where the earlier, older generations didn't look, and I definitely see that in this work, it's still difficult, I think, for a lot of artists to really be influenced, to be open to 19th century, the whole world of 19th century visual culture in a strange way, even though it's such a legacy of, we're more influenced by that, with the entire visual culture that we have now, movies, everything, Do you know what I mean?
Sure. When you say 19th century painting, I guess I think of Constable.
Yeah.
Of course,
it's one of them. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in its own way, there's an awful lot that happened in that time in terms of visual culture as well, because it kind of gives you then also the Impressionists.
At the end, there's Turner and then the Pre-Raphaelites, which was a completely different sense of like reacting against Constable and Turner in a way. Even in paintwork and composition, you can see the generational thing going there. So the way Turner painted and the way the Pre-Raphaelites painted, the types of brush, the types of colour, the types of even layering and transparencies and deliberate influences. So the Pre-Raphaelites, who were later than Turner and Constable, they were looking at things that Turner and Constable were uncomfortable looking at. So say like Raphael and earlier, in art history. And so that applies to this as well. I mean, I'm comfortable looking at things. I'm comfortable looking at things and understanding them, and feel free to be influenced by them. Whereas older artists might be a bit afraid, or and it'll happen to me with younger painters. I'm sure, which is part of the fun.
Well, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things going on in this, and I think one of the things that I discussed with you is just in terms of like image composition again, and the fact that the sort of the background, which in a way to me, and pardon me if this is a very surface reading, but it sort of seems to be you're still talking to Walters, you're still having a conversation with Walters. But what I found so interesting about that is that the background is very colourful, and those things in the foreground are sort of much more grey, and that might be that might sort of contrast to sort of a way of thinking about image making conventionally.
Oh yeah.
Sort of inverted it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not extreme. There is still a lot of muting and foiling. Foiling colour is a technical term. In those colours in the background, it's actually quite similar to the other one with regard to the type of muting and the use of grey and very different grey. So you can make a grey out of a whole bunch of pigments, and then next to it can be a grey out of a whole bunch of completely different pigments, and it's very, very interesting. It's still complex colour, like the human eye can see a lot of colour, which we forget because we look at colour through the camera, and but painting doesn't work like that. You really have to see. You have to see a painting and be like, if you looked at a photo of a painting, you haven't seen the painting. It's it should be a rule of thumb that everyone thinks about.
Sure, because there's an enormous difference between colour from pigment and colour from pixel.
And say glazing and transparency. So it's a huge thing in painting is glazing. I mean, you look at the great Bill Hammond. Bill Hammond uses very, very transparent pigments very thin. And I mean, I do that as well, often, not in these works, but, and you have to see it and the human eye can perceive whether there's a transparent yellow over a opaque green, or vice versa, you know, I mean, it just adds up to why painting is a very articulate and rich art form. Yeah.
You mentioned foiling as a technique. Can you just give us a little bit of insight into what that involves?
A classic is using a turquoise is a real classic to have on a palette or as a tube of paint. You can mix that with a little bit of a brown or red, or especially when you're doing something say realistic, like painting, you know, the figure or something. A lot of pigments are just too higher, bright. They're too bright, too higher chroma, and the real world isn't like that. But I mean, if you used a slightly different turquoise to foil a red and make it a bit less bright, then it will make a completely different red. It's quite uncontrollable. It's almost uncontrollable. It's not consciously controllable. Over the years, you just get used to what pigment does what. You sort of just feel it, you know. It's a non-explicit art form. You know, yeah.
I'm thinking now of there's a sort of a classic title by Josef Albers, who was a kind of a really significant art theorist of kind of peak modernism, I guess. And it was interaction of colour, and he really did a whole bunch of experiments with these, you know, the way a colour looks, and it depends on what's around it. You don't get because you never get one of these colours in isolation. It's always sitting next to something else.
Yeah.
And what that something else is affects how you perceive it.
Yeah. There's definitely references. I said Annie Albers, the great textile artist. I mean, with this pattern thing, it's definitely textile vibe, deliberate. And also the reference to Walters, I have to say, is completely deliberate, and it's meant to be incredibly obvious. It's not meant to. You're not meant to go up like, oh, he's sneakily ripping off Walters. No, like within the world of painting and people who know, it's like this is an obvious riff. This is an obvious riff. You know, it's kind of like Rembrandt doing a version of the Descent from the Cross because he loves Rubens's Descent from the Cross. You know, it's kind of like, and so yeah.
Right.
There's always different levels of what people know what's going on. And, you know, the artist knows that. We know that with our work, and we build it in we build different levels of way things work. Yeah.
I think sort of spending a bit of time with a painting like this as well, and that's one of the real joys of you know, really good painting, is that these things kind of can reveal themselves to you over time. You know, you know, there's all of these different layers of reference and you know, visual layers that one can experience.
I like to think one thing I came up with to say about the art form is that it sits on the wall for decades, and you sort of, it's just an object there. You don't really look at it consciously, and every now and again you look at it consciously for like maybe a minute or 30 seconds. So it works sort of in the background in your life, and every now and again it works really direct. It's sort of, that's how I expect. That's how we make them to work. I think. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a kind of an interesting thing. I mean, because I think one of the things that painting does in a really interesting way is it sort of captures and accumulates time.
Yeah, definitely. With that frozen movement thing, but a real accumulation, because all paintings are an accumulation of brushstrokes, and a work that's on the slower side, which I think mine is, has a real big accumulation of that time. So just adds up to the complexity and stuff. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about? Yeah,
indeed. I mean, there's lots of different layers to it, I think, as well, because there's also this other accumulation. Because I look at this and I sort of see classical sculpture.
Subject matter and accumulation of history, layers of reference going back through visual influence, you know, and it's just amazing, and you keep learning. Like the wings outstretched thing that's one's from Egypt, but it's like you see it in Zoroastrian. You see the influences coming through. This is not just in visual culture. This is all culture. Influences, cross-pollinations, whatever you call it, around the world. It's an ongoing thing. It's a bit of a bias, which I'm definitely feel like I was and have been reacting against the sort of modernist idea that the modernists were the start of something or was something singular. It's completely not. High abstraction comes from Africa and Asia. It's, like minimalism comes from Japan. It's like, there's always legacies and influences, and it's not always exclusive either. Things go back and forth. It's very complex and hard to entirely grasp. So a good way to talk about it is in the visual medium, because it's less of a conscious thing. Maybe you can talk about that sort of thing.
It's an interesting. I think one of the things about modernism that is really fascinating is the way that there was this kind of intention to find a kind of a tabula rasa, like a complete new beginning. And I think it's like Malevich and that black square. That's a sort of a fascinating attempt to sort of nullify the history of painting in a sense.
And at the same time, it's just another thing in history. The iconoclast impulse happened with the Reformation, and then, they would do it in ancient Egypt. They would scratch the faces off, scratch the names off, Akhenaten, and it just goes on. That impulse is there as well. And it'll probably come back, I guess. And you know what I mean? And modernism was just another one, going back to tabula rasa. Don't you think?
Oh, yeah. Indeed. No, I think
the fun of it,
the fascinating thing is the way that you just can't. No matter the attempt, it just sort of doesn't succeed. It becomes historical. It becomes part of a bigger story of, human existence and visual culture.
Yeah. There's definitely a kind of, at the same time it's like Dada and stuff, which was like humorous. There's certainly a humour in Malevich in a way, a sort of Russian folk. He went back after that abstraction, that pure abstraction, he went back into like being influenced by textiles, which he was, it was like Russian folk textiles and stuff, and that's really important and awesome. There's levels of seriousness and not seriousness, and the more you get into it, the more you read which artist was doing what and stuff.
And some of them were really genuinely funny.
Yeah. And some of them didn't know they were funny. I don't know. Hopefully.
Sure.
I don't know what I am.
Something that we spoke about in relation to this painting and coming back to textiles is that you talked about the influence that of textile exhibition that you saw.
Oh yeah, so maybe like 1993, when I was still at high school, and really into art, I saw two exhibitions at the Auckland Museum. One was actually of the Auckland Islands residency artists. So that was the amazing Bill Hammond on metal over there, just you can sort of see behind me, was probably from that period. And it was an amazing show. There was great Bill Hammonds, small ones like that in that show, but also a show of Kuba textiles from Congo, Zaire. I can't remember what it was at the time, but amazing, sophisticated abstraction. Really big show, and just amazing to see in New Zealand. That had a huge impact on me. I was really into abstraction at the time, like sort of really into Twombly and McCann, and as a teenage painter, and that show just fitted. It just like they were thinking to the same level, as Mondrian. A lot of it's kind of like horizontals and verticals, like a lot of Mondrian. Who I love Mondrian, and but there's Cuba, there's African, mostly women, making the same sort of decisions, and it was good to be exposed to at that age. You realise that visual sophistication is just depends on a person, doesn't really depend on where they're from, and
or that historical kind of canonization.
Yeah, there is complicated stuff can be made by anyone, and it's beautiful to be able to look at it. Growing up in New Zealand, I went to see Te Māori. I went to Te Māori when I guess I must have been about 8 or 7. I mean, that just like made me an artist as well. As well as maybe the Picasso show when I was about 10. Big Picasso show at the Auckland City Art Gallery, stuff like this. But you know, I mean, being a visually obsessed person from a young age, yeah, good place to be.
Sure.
Do
Yeah,
you
I
think?
Absolutely. I remember vaguely seeing the Tamale exhibition myself.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
A couple of years younger than you.
Yeah.
I was a little kid when I saw it in New Zealand. It was amazing.
Yeah.
I wonder if we just want to have a quick look at some of these Hammond works, because you mentioned seeing his Auckland Island residency works, and this is really from around about that time, 1990.
Yeah.
Companions of Misery, this one is.
So, yeah, this would have been after he came back. No, 1990, yeah. So I would have seen that in 92 or 93. So, yeah.
Would you say Hammond is an influence?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I like late Hammond as well. You know, early and late, like even really late Hammond. My Auckland art dealer Ivan Anthony showed Hammond for a very long time, and so I would see them come into the gallery, and I get to see all of them up close and taking them in, and then I would hear people come in because he's so popular, deservedly. But with popularity, you get a lot of people who are fans but don't really know the level of, they're not painters themselves. There's a whole other level, which painters we talk to each other, especially because we know that we the other painters speak the language, but we want everyone else to maybe not, you just feel the rhythms and it's more about a feeling thing than an explicit knowing, not that any of it's explicit knowledge in painting. But anyway, do you know this sort of thing? So, he's just an amazing composer. This work doesn't work smaller in the catalogue. I didn't think it was very good, but then seeing it at scale, it's brilliant. It really works.
And then that's a sort of a fascinating thing about painting, isn't it? The way in which it isn't just image; it is image, but it's also something else. Just to do with its physicality and its material and the way that the paint sort of accumulates on the surface. And this is something that Hammond does amazingly well, I think, as these kind of runs, because it's...
Yeah, his work is acrylic.
Yeah.
So it's water-based as opposed to oil paint, which is oil-based. And so acrylic, Bill is great with water as a medium, which is a beautiful medium. And so he really... plays to the strength of that very much. I think another, Michael Harrison is another one who does that with acrylic, really uses acrylic really well with water. Transparency, there's a lot of transparent colours in this, like the paint, he uses a particular Payne's Grey, one particular brand, I think, especially he uses a lot of very transparent pigment. And this green is a real transparent green, which he uses, but also he uses a lot of metallic. So, and I think that his use of metallic really offsets the weakness of acrylic paint, which is, one of the brilliant things about what Hammond did. And also the varnishing, really, anyway. But I always looked at his work and, as another painter. So I always go up close.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sort of your insights into Bill's work. I wonder if we can sort of perhaps come back to this season over here. Well, this is something that I thought was kind of perhaps an interesting thing to kind of get into now, is perhaps if we just... We've been here with a live Instagram audience, so a few questions have come in while we've been having a conversation. So perhaps we can just run through a few of those.
Has my travel inspired me? Yes, that's really the best education for anyone to learn about painting is to go to the great museums around the world. Yeah, so firstly, travel for me has been to see painting and art. My first trip overseas was 2003, and went all over Europe and Russia. There's a lot of great paintings in Russia, and saw a lot of stuff which really you don't understand in reproductions. I guess probably about that time I really started to understand Matisse, who is still a huge influence, and something like you just seeing the complexity, the sheer complexity of a Matisse. You really just can't get it in the books, you know. It's just, but this applies to all the greats, you know. Yeah, and regional stuff. All painting, all art, all painting is regional. It's based on a time and a place, even if that place is important, like New York or London. It's still specific. Has its sensibility. It's, you know, German painting. Going to Germany, even seeing the people. There's a lot of portraiture in German painting. Lucas Cranach and the landscape. Caspar David Friedrich. Yeah, even people in landscape. The scale of the built environment, and then the artist responding to it. You can see all that stuff even now, hundreds of years later. I mean, I hope that sort of is interesting, an interesting answer for the person.
Sure.
But do you know? Do you have the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. I think a really interesting part of the kind of discourse of visual culture in New Zealand has been the experience of international influence through reproduction.
Yeah.
And you know, that's especially evident in something like Walters. I think there's you know, some scholarship on that even. But you know, this has been a recurring theme of the conversation that we've been having this evening, has been the encounter of the artwork physically, directly, rather than through reproduction. That's a very different experience.
Yeah, it's a bit of an impoverished, but it's not overwhelming. But if you're sensitive, you can still be influenced by the visual culture that's here. And I mean, in my generation, there was a lot of painting to see, like good painting, McCann and Van der Velden, and but it's definitely still true.
Yes, it has its own. There's a specificity to sort of New Zealand painting, which is quite unique in the world. So another question for you there, Andrew, is at what age did you decide you wanted to be an artist?
Well, I it was probably, so like when I was at primary school, I liked drawing and stuff the most, so I wanted to do something like that from that age. But then it took me till I was about 15 till I sort of learnt the differences, the different traditions, you know, so whether I wanted to go towards comics or illustration or graphic design or like painting or and you know, it takes you a few years to distinguish the different traditions and feel what you like. So I guess when I was about 15, definitely had a good art teacher and she had a good library at the high school I went to, Mount Roskill in Auckland, and that was basically it. From then, the age of 15, totally, yeah.
And it's always been about paint for you, hasn't it?
Yeah. I guess I just was lucky to respond to. It's a very articulate, big, complicated tradition and medium, and so it's very free to, it's not a restricted, it's a very big art form to go into. So I guess when you're young, you can see yourself going into it, you will have freedom within it. You'll have, Is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a sort of an interesting kind of way of, you know, relating to the world through painting, I think. And a question that kind of on a similar theme is, you know, is it weird looking back at old paintings of yours?
Yes. Yeah. So I saw this work. I saw the three works week before last. I came to have a look with the other painter, Liz Moore, the other great painter. So we came to see our works on a sunny day at the viewing at the entrance, and it was like it was really hard work. It felt like hard work. It's very revealing of your own sense. It makes you nervous because you don't know if you'll like it, and you can't tell if you'll like it by looking at the photo in the catalogue. You have to see the real thing to see if you think it's good, or whether its weaknesses outweighs its strengths, or whether you pitch that balance of weaknesses and strengths, authenticity, professionalism, good composition, complicated composition. Balancing all those things is an elusive, difficult thing, and I've always worked very hard at that and never been easy on myself about it. So, I mean, it's very confronting. I can see a lot about my own use of paint and my own sense of composition, and I think about the times, and even my personality. I mean, the job of being an artist involves too much introspection, really. That's just the downside of this job. And I've always taken that seriously, so yeah, it's not easy. It's just more introspection from things I'd maybe forgotten or gotten over, or artistically and personally. You know, it's very, very involved, complicated thing looking at old work. It's work, but I want to do it. I really want to do the work so that I continue to be a better painter, because painting is not a youth cult. It's like nothing else. I can make my best work. Maybe my good work is still yet to come, you know. And yeah, you know.
Yeah.
There's the question.
So much to learn with painting, isn't there?
Yeah.
Here's something somewhat lighter. Why did you choose to paint butterflies? Well, at the time, I mean, there's always the garden influence of growing up in a garden. My parents were really into gardening, and I grew up in an amazing garden, and that sort of visual influence is huge, and it's still there in my new work. You know, it's and I'm working square art as well, like this one actually, at the moment. So, but at the time, I was going through a period of being nostalgic about the children's book illustration I saw. This is involved. When I was in the 70s and, you know, maybe early 80s, that is also an influence, but it's often like British American illustrators who are highly trained in the same tradition of fine art painting, so they know a lot about Matisse and, you know, stuff like that, you know, but then they went into illustration, and I could tell by this stage I could see that. And so that's another, I mean, that kind of cross subcultural influence is something that I was really interested in, and I knew that people weren't going to understand it. It was a convoluted thing, but it made total creative sense. So, and also the way a children's book illustrator is pitching the image to a child is really interesting, actually. Especially, maybe not so much now. Maybe that's kind of gone now. There was the golden age of illustration, I think, and it's different now. And children are different now. So, and I'm not young, so I don't know anything about it. So that feedback, but between, as a convoluted browsing illustration and adjacent worlds of visual culture or design is always something I've done, and I think it's important to do, and you should feel free, and I have. So, but it can influence, but also with the subject matter of that stuff, and I think my generation as well, and maybe me, there's a kind of lack of. I'm not too worried about. I'm from the North Island, you know. There's a different influence of it, Pacific influence. You know, I mean, I'm in my mid-40s. You know, there's a lot of Pacific influence in Auckland, which you wouldn't have in the South Island, which is where Bill Hammond is from. So there's none of a whole bunch of stuff in Bill's work. There's a whole bunch of landscape, environmental stuff in his work, direct from his environment, which is beautiful. But I had a different one, and that includes personality stuff. I mean, Auckland we have the Pacific influence is a different
sort of personality. So I mean, masculinity, the sort of heroic man alone, using things like childish emotions or camp, or these things are all free to my generation and a North Islander that are not quite available to previous generations in different places. Maybe I think it's important to say for me.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. And that sort of the energy and colour of this work really makes me think of that sort of Pacifica kind of visual culture.
Yeah.
So here's another question for you. Maybe this is a slightly thorny one. What is your favourite painting in the room?
Oh, in the room. Oh, it's like, I mean, you can't. I can never say, like, even with my own shows, I never have a favourite. And the good thing is that each work. So in a show, each work in a show by the one artist should play to the strengths of the individual work. So I always emphasise people to do that, to realise that each work has its own logic, each individual work, even by the same artist done in the same year. So, and like the good work in the room does that, and that's the way you should always look at any good work. You're not, say a Hammond, it's not just a Hammond. A Lismore, it's not just a Lismore, it's that Lismore, but in the room it's like top level stuff is that Lismore, Hammond, Wilkinson, who is someone I went to art school with, he's amazing. Like his sensibility, his ability to dream. Brent Harris, it's nice to see a great Australian. He's really a great artist. There's probably some smaller stuff I can't see. There's stuff that's influenced me, like Colleen has influenced me a lot, definitely.
Sure. And this is sort of in a similar vein, and perhaps equally difficult to answer, is what is your favourite painting of all time?
I guess emotional reaction would be, honest emotional reactions has been Matisse's, and actually, maybe similarly, but I think my favourite living New Zealand artist is Susan Te Kahurangi King. So, and I've had similar reactions to her work, actually, to seeing great Matisse's. Mm-hmm. So, that's the start of an answer. It's not the whole answer.
Yeah, sure. I think in the history of painting, it's sort of hard to sort of single out individual works that kind of, but I think sometimes if you have a particular emotional engagement with a work, that's a really kind of a telling thing, or something that speaks to you on a whole bunch of different levels at once. Rather than necessarily a technical or a visual. But I've got one last question for you to wrap it up, and that is, did you ever meet Bill Hammond, and what was he like?
Oh yes, I met Bill Hammond when my partner at the time, Liz Moore, was wanted to do a portrait of him, and so we went to the studio and hung out. He's very much based in his place, Littleton, and I would have liked to have got to know him a bit better, but various reasons. I wasn't drinking at the time because I was very ill, and my partner wasn't drinking either because she was very ill in different ways. And Bill had a great life involving more alcohol, just little things, different parts of the country and different generations. Mm-hmm. Liz got on with him really well. My partner, she's a lot funnier than I am. And so, and he appreciated her humour, I think, which is, not everyone does. I knew his work. I knew him through his work, which he would think would be more important for another painter to know him. We know each other through our work. The job is to get a person on the wall. Mm-hmm. It's part of, you have to get, like authentic work, you've got to put yourself into the work. And So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And that's a really fascinating thing I think about the three works of yours that are in the room, is there is a through line, even though they're all visually and technically different, there is something which is very much of your own sort of sensibility that comes across through all of them.
Thanks, I'm glad you think that.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your time this evening, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and some fascinating insights that you've offered us into your work and the work of some of the artists that you admire and who are your peers. So that's been really a pleasure to talk to you. So thanks everyone for joining us on our Instagram Live. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. This fantastic collection of art, including Andrew's three wonderful paintings, will be up for auction on Sunday at 2:30 p.m. So please do join us for that. It will be live streamed, and you can also be in the room with us for that auction this Sunday. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.